Good evening and welcome to the February 3rd Thursday lecture. My name is Ryoko Matsuba and I work here at the Sainsbury Institute as a lecturer in Japanese literature, art, and humanities. So we got already over 100 audience here today. Thank you so much for coming. This evening, we are welcoming Dr. Joshua Frydman to hear the talk entitled Reflections of the Sun Goddess and the Evolution of Japanese Myth over Time. Dr. Joshua Frydman is Assistant Professor of Japanese in the Department of Modern Languages, Literatures, and Linguistics at the University of Oklahoma. His recently published works include The Japanese Myth, A Guide to Gods, Spirits, and Heroes in 2022, and Inscribed Object and the Development of Literature in Early Modern in 2023. His expertise covers the development of writing systems in East Asia and worldwide, and the role of transregional and global cultural interactions in the development of pre-modern societies as viewed through literature and art. This evening, we will have a privilege of hearing his lecture on mythology surrounding the Japanese deity, Amaterasu, sun goddess, and progenitrix of the imperial family. The session will run until around 7, followed for 10 minutes by a Q&A. There are two different textbooks. One is a chat box, and the other is a Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Please post your questions or for Joshua in the Q&A box, either before or during the Q&A session. I will now hand over to Joshua.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Matsuba, and thank you to everybody at the Sainsbury Institute for giving me this incredible opportunity. I'm very excited to share this talk with you today. When I first set out to write a book introducing the Japanese myths, I researched both other works aimed at general audiences about Japanese mythology, as well as those on other famous mythological systems like the Greco-Roman, Norse, or ancient Egyptian mythologies. What I discovered was that most works that intend to explain mythology, especially those that are the most famous old world mythologies to English speakers, like the Greco-Roman and Roman and Norse myths I just mentioned, look at the stories and deities they explain as how they were seen in the past, as if that was just one point in time. Most of this is in the English-speaking world are long gone in the present. We don't know, for example, how the average ancient Egyptian person worshipped their gods, or what stories resonated with the average person in ancient Northern Europe. Japan, however, is one example of a society where, to put it bluntly, the myths have never died out. Gods, heroes, and the stories about them are not understood in the same ways that they were 200, 500, or 1,000 years ago, but they're still there. This is why when I set out to write about the Japanese myths, I decided to focus on the fact that Japanese mythology remains a living thing, a part of people's lives in Japan even today. The continuity of the Japanese myths makes for a great example of an aspect of mythology that is not usually emphasized, at least not in books aimed at general audiences in the English-speaking world. And this is how much mythology changes over time to reflect the changing realities of its culture. I think about this as a diachronic axis to the study and presentation of mythology. By this, I mean the observation of how an individual myth, figure, story, or a network of them changes over time to match the changing needs of the people who tell, worship, or simply know it. This talk will demonstrate an example of this process through a set of famous Japanese myths, namely those about Amaterasu, the sun goddess and ancestor of the imperial clan, and her younger brother Susanoo, and how they have developed between the earliest records we have, dating from the 8th century CE, all the way to today. Since one way to gain a visceral understanding of changes in stories is to see how they are represented in myth, I'm going to use artwork to show how representations of these deities have changed. Of course, there'll still be story time. I'm going to start by explaining the one particular set of myths about these deities as they're presented in the 8th century texts before shifting to artwork that will show how representations and thoughts about them have changed over the intervening centuries. First, there's a little bit of basic information that I feel we should discuss, and that has to do with the religion most commonly associated with most of these deities, and that is Shinto. Although there are several religions present in Japan today, and there have been for all of Japanese recorded history, albeit different ones at different points, what we generally think of as the Japanese myths are associated most strongly with the religion that we today call Shinto. Unlike Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, or later arrivals like Christianity, all of which came from outside Japan, Shinto has its roots in native practices, specifically worship of some of the same gods that we see in the ancient myths. And that's why I feel that I should dive into this a little bit more before we get to the story time. Shinto, or the way of the gods, is, again, Japan's only native belief system. In some ways, it may not appear much like a religion at all. It has no sacred texts, although there are texts that at different times have been considered sacred. There is nothing continuous. And for much of its history, the Shinto priesthood was organized under and through the imperial court, as opposed to existing as a self-fulfilling religious institution. Most of its modern definitions and even the name Shinto are the result of scholars from the medieval era onward deciding what is or is not part of the religion. And even today, one can find arguments about what counts as Shinto or not. At its most basic, and to generalize horribly, Shinto is basically the worship of kami, or gods. There's no easy definition of a kami. Some, particularly those we'll talk about from the ancient myths, are named and embodied as specific figures like Amaterasu, who is the sun goddess and has some elements reflecting that definition. These kami are the most similar to the named gods of other pantheons, but they are far from the only ones. Natural locations, such as mountains and rivers, have individual kami, as too do individual animals, plants, and even objects like swords or mirrors. A given mountain, such as Mount Fuji, is the home of many kami, is a singular kami itself, and is a place controlled by the kami of mountains in general, all simultaneously. This simultaneous existence as multiple things is not a problem, because rational logic is not what defines a kami, only the fact that people believe in and acknowledge its existence. Most of what we today call the ancient Japanese myths can be traced back to the 7th and 8th centuries CE, which is the oldest period in Japan for which we have written records. These ancient works are a fitting place to begin our discussion because they also happen to be the oldest record of the myths specifically. The two oldest books written in Japan that survive to the present are a pair of historical chronicles, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. Both of these works begin with the creation of the world and present history through the ages to almost the moments of their own creation. The Kojiki, or Record of Ancient Matters, was compiled in 712 and is the oldest extant work of literature in Japanese. It begins with, the creation of the world and lasts until the reign of Empress Regnant Suiko, roughly the turn of the 7th century, so about 100 years before it was actually written. Its last 5 reigns worth are considered vaguely historically accurate, but the vast majority is not considered a historical document. It's a relatively short document with 3 books, an upper book that chronicles the reign of the gods down to the lineage of the first emperor, a middle book that follows the first emperor and then the next 14 of his descendants, and a lower book that follows the next 15 traditional rulers. Again, the last 5 or so of whom are considered roughly historically accurate. Supposedly, the work was originally a series of oral histories, and it's written in what's a very difficult to read hybrid of literary Sinitic, otherwise known as classical Chinese, the Latin of pre-modern East Asia, and vernacular Japanese, or Old Japanese. In contrast to the Kojiki, the Nihon Shoki tells similar myths in a very different way. The Nihon Shoki was finished in 720, and its name is the Chronicles of Japan, and it tries to live up to that title. It is a much larger work of 30 books. The first 2 cover the Age of the Gods, and the remaining 28 cover the first 46 traditional reigns. So it goes well past where the Kojiki ends. The Nihon Shoki follows the exact format of an ancient Chinese dynastic chronicle, where every reign is divided into a year, month, and day. The language in which it's written is also Orthodox literary Sinitic, and some scholarship actually appears to suggest it may have been written by native speakers, which raises some interesting questions about who they might have been and what they were doing in Japan. Although the basic features of most of the mythology retold within the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are the same, there are other important differences in their presentation beyond just the language in which each document was written. The Kojiki presents a single focused narrative, its main diversions being long genealogical lists that show which clans were descended from which deities. Many of these clans were still present in the early 8th century, and scholars today think that the Kojiki's purpose was actually genealogical, to show which clans at the time came from which gods, and therefore needed to serve the imperial family because their ancestors had served Amaterasu. It's logical. If your great-grandparent served someone else's great-grandparent, shouldn't you obviously still owe them your allegiance? The Nihon Shoki, in contrast, presents the stories of the gods in a comparative manner that's honestly fairly unique among East Asian documents. The Chinese antecedents on which the Nihon Shoki is based do not have an Age of the Gods section. Even the Shiji, the famous ancient history of China from the early Han Dynasty, begins with the reigns of legendary rulers such as the Yellow Emperor. So the Nihon Shoki created its own model. It tells the myths as a main narrative, but every section of the main narrative is followed by a series of paragraphs that each begin, "One book says," "One book says," and then present alternate and sometimes very divergent versions of the myths. For the record, whenever the Kojiki differs from the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki's version is always present as one of the One Book Says, which implies that there was feedback between the 2 chronicles, even though neither one explicitly mentions the other. The modern understanding of why the Nihon Shoki might do this is that it may have been meant as a historical text to present to outsiders, potentially the Chinese, to show that Japan did have its own mythology and that it was scholarly in how it was presented. What is really important about both of these works as well is that neither one of them is a religious text by what we might understand today. There is nothing about worship and very little about the ways in which humans and gods interact in either of these works. Both the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki begin with the creation of the world. Originally, the world was formless. At some point, the first god or gods come into existence, depending on the version. There are between 1 and 5. They are invisible and have no solid form, and with one exception, are not widely known, and their names rarely reappear in Japanese history. Following this first generation of gods, we get 6 more who are male-female pairs, each of whom birth the next one. The final pair, so the 7th overall generation, are Izanagi, he who beckons, and Izanami, she who beckons. Izanagi and Izanami are called before the 6 previous generations and commanded to create the islands of Japan, and by extension, the entire physical world. They're presented with the Spear of Heaven, which has 2 testicular jewels dangling from it, make of that what you will, and they thrust the spear into the formless, chaotic water of the world and use it to make the first island. Izanagi and Izanami then go down to this island where they wed. In both chronicles, the pair encounters some problems getting their wedding ritual right, which results in malformed children until they do proceed to figure out how to do it correctly. And then they proceed to birth the islands of Japan and all of the gods who inhabit them. At this point, the 2 chronicles differ. In the Nihon Shoki, Izanagi and Izanami eventually produce Amaterasu, the sun goddess, her brother Tsukuyomi, the moon god, about whom very little is actually said, and Susanoo, whose definition we're going to get to in a few minutes. This is important because both the male and female deities are necessary for this creation, but this is not the way it works in the Kojiki. In the Kojiki, Izanami never makes it this far. She dies giving birth to the god of fire, Kagutsuchi, and goes to Yomi, the land of the dead. Izanagi pursues her, and when she refuses to stop being dead and come back with him, he divorces her in the first divorce in history, according to the ancient chronicles. This not only leads to death entering the world, but Izanagi has to purify himself. So after he returns from Yomi, he bathes. And when he washes his face, Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susanoo are born from his 2 eyes and nose, respectively. So in the Kojiki version, which today is the more well-known one, the deities have, these most important deities have no mother and are solely the creations of a male power. Scholars have different arguments about this. No one knows exactly what to do with it, but it's a very interesting split. Regardless of the method of creation, both texts agree that the trio initially rule the world as 3 separate kingdoms. Amaterasu receives heaven, Tsukuyomi the night, and Susanoo the sea. However, the youngest of the gate deities abandons his charge of ruling the sea. Susanoo ends up crying and complaining and wailing about how unfair life is. Izanagi gets annoyed at his son and exiles him, and so he flees up to heaven. After a debate, Amaterasu lets him in, and somewhat inadvertently, the texts are both sort of mysterious about this, but it seems to be against his own will, Susanoo proceeds to destroy heaven. He tears up Amaterasu's carefully cultivated rice plots. He defecates in her weaving hall. He then takes one of her horses, skins it backwards from its tail to its head, and throws it into that same weaving hall. The weaving hall is the scene of a lot of things, especially in the Nihon Shoki. Amaterasu is really upset and ashamed by her brother's actions, and so she hides away in the Heavenly Rock Cave, which is, there are at least 5 caves in Japan that claim to be this. When she hides away, all of the light goes out of the world. With Amaterasu in hiding, there's no light or heat, and the other gods of heaven try to figure out what to do. They eventually decide to lure her out by constructing a beautiful mirror and a strand of jewels and hanging them in a tree outside the cave. Ame no Uzume, the goddess of joy and dance, then strips down to her underclothes and performs a provocative dance that makes all the other gods laugh. Amaterasu thinks it's curious that people are laughing when she's locked herself away, so she peers out from the cave, at which point one of the gods of strength pulls her out and another throws a rope up behind her so she can't go back. This restores light to the world. She ends up being so enamored of the mirror and the jewel strand that she takes them with her, and they become 2 of the 3 imperial regalia that supposedly still exist in Japan as treasures of the imperial family even today. So what happens to Susanoo? He's punished. I believe they pull his fingernails and toenails out and then shave his beard. And then the other gods send him down to earth. Susanoo arrives in what's now Shimane Prefecture on the Japan seacoast of southern Honshu. He finds an old couple, an old man and an old woman, who are sobbing and hugging a young girl. When he asks them what happened, it turns out that they are local gods and had 8 beautiful daughters. The Yamata no Orochi, a horrific serpent-like creature, often called a dragon, with 8 heads and 8 tails, has shown up every year and has devoured the previous 7 daughters and is now on his way to eat the final 8th sacrifice. Susanoo is very taken with this woman and offers to save her if she will marry him, which she agrees. He changes her to a comb and sticks her in his hair, and then builds 8 sake vats and fills them with sake. The Orochi shows up, immediately goes to drink, and gets drunk as each of its heads drinks from one of the 8 sake vats. While it's sleeping, Susanoo cuts its heads and tails off, killing it. His sword actually snaps as he's cutting one of the tails, and he uses the hilt to dig around inside the tail and finds an even prettier sword. And this is Kusanagi, the grass cutter, the last of the 3 imperial regalia. He presents Kusanagi to Amaterasu as a way of apology. She forgives Susanoo and allows him to stay on Earth. And that's where this sequence of myths ends. So one question that modern scholars have returned to again and again has been, what is actually going on in these myths and what do these deities represent? And it's the second question that we're going to talk about here. Although, of course, if you want to know more about what might actually be happening in the stories themselves, feel free to ask questions about that. So Amaterasu is clearly the sun. She emits light, and when she goes away, all the light leaves the world. But she's also a farmer and a weaver, and runs a compound, if not an entire small kingdom. She has carefully cultivated rice fields. She performs silk weaving or has people under her to do weaving, and she models the settled agricultural life of the early Japanese. She will be the progenitor of the imperial clan, but that's actually not important yet. It's her connection to civilization that is. Michael Como, a scholar of Japanese religions, has linked Amaterasu's portrayal to other East Asian weaver goddesses that appear in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese myth. These are all aligned with wet rice agriculture and silk cultivation, which are hallmarks of North Chinese civilization since at least the early 1st millennium BCE, and generally were taken across East Asia to be idealized civilizing factors. Konoshi Takamitsu, whose analysis of the Kojiki's worldview has informed scholarship since the 1980s, further places Amaterasu's heaven as an image of the settled perfection that the early Japanese state wanted to create. Susanoo's wanton, if unintentional, destruction of these factors appears as important to Amaterasu's portrayal as does her ability to create or take away sunlight. So what do we make of Susanoo then? Well, he appears, by contrast, to represent the powerful and untamed forces of nature itself. Susanoo flees his own overburned emotions and responsibilities to a place of safety in heaven, only to end up inadvertently destroying it. Yet when he returns to Earth, he becomes a hero who saves things from even greater devastation. Neither ancient chronicle says exactly what Susanoo is the god of, in as much as that means anything, but modern scholarship sees him as the opposite of Amaterasu in terms of representing chaotic, unbridled, and morally ambiguous natural forces. Susanoo tears apart fields and monstrous beasts alike, and although he cannot be contained, he can himself contain things. So this is the portrayal in texts from approximately 1300 years ago. What has happened over the intervening centuries? To understand this, we need to begin turning to artwork. And we're going to start by jumping forward a few centuries. There are not many surviving pictures or icons of Amaterasu from before the 12th century CE. Some of the earliest portrayals of her, as well as of Susanoo, although those are fewer, are actually from a Buddhist context. Buddhism, a religion originally from South Asia, had gained importance across Central Asia, China, and the Korean Peninsula before reaching Japan, which it did sometime in the late 5th or early 6th centuries, we think. It was known as a foreign religion, even in its earliest recorded references. The Nihon Shoki actually has a record of its arrival in Japan as a gift from the king of a Korean kingdom, Paekche, presumably in 550 CE, although the date is a little messy. And modern scholars think the entire story is apocryphal. We don't really have time to devote to a proper explanation of what Buddhism is, but for the context of this talk, by the 12th and 13th centuries CE, many native Japanese deities were being portrayed in ways that mimic or are directly connected to those of Buddhist deities, most of which were imported from India or China. And the icon and image here are examples of Amaterasu's Buddhist medieval form, Uho Doji. Uho Doji is actually first referenced as a separate and male deity in late 9th century Buddhist treatises, including one supposedly written by Kukai, the founder of Shingon Buddhism. He is a protector deity, a guardian of sacred jewels known as Chintamani in Sanskrit, Nyoi Hoju in Japanese, which grant wishes. He is also a protector of the relics of famous Buddhists due to an association between these wish-granting jewels and the magical powers of Buddhist relics. Bernard Faure, another very famous scholar of Japanese religions, has written extensively about this, including about how Uho Doji shifts from wish granter to protector, and then merges with Amaterasu. This merger occurs sometimes between the 9th and 11th centuries. And again, by the 12th, when we start seeing these images, Uho Doji has become fully identified as a Buddhist version of Amaterasu. One reason appears to be both of them are connected to jewels, the jewel strand in the ancient myth, as well as Uho Doji's use of jewels for wish granting. But there may be other more complex reasons which relate to various different Buddhist deities that are also females who have solar imagery. To look at the iconography of these paintings, the painting and the icon, I want to call your attention to several features. The first is that these are both wearing sort of generic pseudo-Chinese female clothing, long hanging robes over loose trousers, and at least in the painting is primarily white, a color of purity in both Shinto and Buddhist context, with a touch of red, which has been a solar color all the way since Han Dynasty China. In addition, they both carry jewels, usually in the left hand, and both have a small pagoda on their heads. These are symbols of the original Uho Doji and are not directly connected to Amaterasu, but allow you to intersperse the two. The figure here is calm and static, almost transcendent in both of these images, and in fact, in all images of Uho Doji. This is not Amaterasu, the active cultivator, or Amaterasu who goes into a cave in shame, but Amaterasu as a distant being that one looks up to and to whom an ordinary person or a priest can pray. And while we do not know exactly when prayer towards any of these deities started, this is a different portrayal in that main aspect from any of those in either myth. Jumping forward again in time to early modern Japan, we see the reintroduction of the stories of the myths. And this is correlated to the spread of woodblock printing. Woodblock printing starts in the early 17th, it comes earlier into Japan, but really kicks off in the early to mid 17th century. And by the mid-19th, when this and several other pictures I will show you come about, had become very widespread. The iconography here does actually appear in things going back to the late 17th century. So while the examples I will show you are late, early modern, they are not only representative of that very late, almost modern time period. This print here is, again, typical iconography for early modern Japanese portrayals of Amaterasu, showing the heavenly rock cave story and Amaterasu emerging to various other deities. Again, I want to call your attention to these specific features. She is wearing the white robes with a touch of red that we saw in the Uho Doji statuary and imagery, is paler and painted more brightly than most of the other deities, and with the exception of one person on the far left, is actually, her head height is above all of the others, in addition to the rays she's obviously emanating. All of the other figures have darker skin, wilder expressions, and are in motion. Whereas Amaterasu, aside from her arm being pulled out of the cave, is completely static. She remains the worshipped figure that we saw from medieval portrayals, even though the elements of her story are being reincorporated, and she is surrounded by lesser, more bestial deities, potentially representing ordinary people. An object like this would have been a personal purchase, not something hung or used at a temple like the medieval portrayals. And this also could have simply been for entertainment, but it does demonstrate that both knowledge of the myth's stories was re-entering cultural norms, as well as mingling with these portrayals of Amaterasu as a figure who could be worshipped. This print from the British Museum is another example of this. From the early 19th century. It's part of a series of prints that give digests of the ancient myths, so that you don't have to go and find a then contemporary Japanese translation or attempt to read the originals yourselves. The picture, which explains the story of the heavenly rock cave, doesn't even feature Amaterasu herself, only the passive rays of light that represent her. It instead focuses on the very active and, again, somewhat more bestially portrayed figures of lesser deities, including Ameno Uzume, the dance goddess, as they attempt to get Amaterasu out. It also has somewhat more violent and dark of a background. While the bonfire is not itself violent, it somewhat mimics the shape of a volcano. And this very clearly is contrasting Amaterasu as a passive, hidden force with the various deities around her. So what about Susanoo? He too reappears in the early modern period. This is an example of not a woodblock print, but a votive painting on wood, although this probably would have hung in either a home or a smaller temple. I'm not exactly sure where this comes from. It wasn't in the information on the British Museum. This example shows Susanoo surrounded by the deities of epidemics, measles, smallpox, etc. The god himself, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but is here in the center. He again is physically above the others, is paler and more composed, wearing less bizarre clothing. This is no direct connection to the ancient myths. The gods of epidemics don't actually appear in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. And while they are a force to be feared, even in early Japan, and there are rituals to protect from them, they are not connected to Susanoo in any quantifiable way until the early modern era. This appears to be the result of Susanoo's raging natural force connection being used to justify him as their leader, as the one who can discipline and control the gods of epidemics. This also means that people can pray to him to prevent them coming. As these diseases were among the things most feared during early modern Japan, including even into the early 19th century, Susanoo now becomes somebody worth worshiping while maintaining his moral ambiguity as somebody who has the power to control and protect people from disease. So on the eve of Japan's modernization in the late 19th century, we see the gods of the ancient myths are still revered, but they've become understood in different ways. Amaterasu is a much more passive force of good that permeates the world like her light, and is not so much connected to cultivation. Whereas Susanoo disciplines and controls destruction, and can be looked up to by commoners and other worshippers as a religious figure. This is going to continue, but also change again a little more dramatically as we move into the modern era. The decades following the Meiji Restoration of 1868 saw Japan flooded with new technologies and culture. The Meiji government rushed to modernize the country to avoid being colonized like so much of the non-Western world had been. This rush led to, among other things, attempts to control and reshape Japan's religions to match those of the most powerful European nations at the time. One thing that several of these European nations had that appeared important to their strength to Japanese observers of the late 19th century were state religions. A state religion is one that is officially supported by the government of a nation and which is protected and promoted by law. As a source of national pride, focus, and identity for citizens, state religion is a useful way to help bind a modern nation state together. The Meiji government thus wanted to create their own national religion to accomplish the same goal, creating a self-identifying and militarily strong citizenry. There was a problem, however. Japan had no single religion that dominated all forms of faith. As both Shinto and Buddhism, as well as others such as Christianity, although still an outlier, had begun to grow again in this era, were practiced in different ways and intermingled, as they still do today. The Meiji government thus had to make a national religion up from scratch. They decided to use Shinto due to it being based on completely native elements, and establish the doctrine and texts of what today is known as state Shinto. This is not what it was called then, it was just known as Shinto, but since World War II, scholars have referred to it as Kokka Shinto or state Shinto. State Shinto has several tenets, such as worshiping the emperor as a god and teaching the ancient myths as literal history in schools. Through actions like this, it directly supported the government's more autocratic and nationalistic tendencies, including the rise of militarism. Not only were the Japanese myths redeployed in schools as historical fact, but they were also pressed into the service of these new goals. And one visual example of this is this portrayal here of Amaterasu and two associate gods from the late Meiji era, so from roughly the 1900s or early 1910s. Amaterasu here is seen floating over two other figures, also gods. On the left, Kasuga Daijin or Kasuga Myojin, the composite god of Kasuga Shrine, and on the right, Hachiman, the god of war. Neither Hachiman nor Kasuga Daijin appear in the ancient myths, and for good reason. They didn't exist at this time. Kasuga Daijin is a composite deity, meaning he's the merger of multiple gods who are all worshipped at the Kasuga Grand Shrine, perhaps the most important Shinto shrine in the city of Nara. This composite was comprised of at least three deities: Ame no Koyane, a smith god, Futsunushi, a god of strength, and Take Mikazuchi, a thunder god who was one of Amaterasu's war leaders in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki myths. The composite doesn't really appear as a single entity until the late Heian, early Kamakura era, but it remains restricted to people who worship at this specific shrine all the way until the Meiji period. In this portrayal and in others from this time, Kasuga Daijin is presented as a Shinto mystic riding a deer. Here, essentially a mystical warrior able to control and fight off evil forces. For Hachiman, he presents an even more interesting addition. Unlike Kasuga Daijin, Hachiman is not really a composite, there's a little bit to it. He's instead primarily a deified human. Minamoto no Yoshiie, an 11th century general who led Japanese forces to victory in northern Honshu against the aboriginal peoples known as the Emishi. Yoshiie was supposedly an unparalleled warrior, and after his death, other warriors began to worship his spirit for luck. Sometime around the 12th century, he merges with a very little-known folk deity called Hachiman, and is also associated with Usa Shrine down in Kyushu, which otherwise has no connection to anything the historical Yoshiie did. And this complex becomes known as Hachiman and is explicitly a god of war, warriors, and martial power. Now, there are medieval examples of these three figures being portrayed together, but there are not many, and they are specific to Kasuga Shrine. But we see examples like this painting appearing in Meiji contexts to a greater extent. And this image does appear to display Amaterasu, here a serene and exalted figure with notably a red sun disk, very clearly the sun, floating over these two militarily focused deities. This iconography exalts military strength as well as mystical strength, and the idea that the imperial family and worship of it exists above both of those. These are the very qualities the Japanese government wished to instill in its population during the decades between the Meiji Restoration and the Second World War. State Shinto warped the gods of the ancient myths into stern deities for citizens to worship. But it had another effect as well, and one that may have an even greater effect on the present. Through teaching the myths in schools and prompting the average person to worship these gods anew, the Japanese government spread awareness of the myths in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki better than any surge of popular religious fervor or entertainment could have. Children from the 1890s through the 1940s grew up learning the stories of Izanagi and Izanami, Amaterasu and Susanoo, and many others. And the ancient myths permeated Japanese culture to possibly the greatest extent they ever have, albeit in reinterpreted fashion. Japan's surrender to the United States in 1945 marked not only the end of the war, but the entire system of state-sponsored military expansion that had existed since the late 19th century. This included state Shinto, which was systematically demolished and dismantled during the US occupation of Japan, which lasted until 1952. However, the widespread knowledge of the Shinto deities and their myths remained, and still remains today, as a background component of Japanese culture. Today, these myths are still sources of personal and national history, artistic inspiration, and even popular culture. In 1959, during the height of the second golden age of Japanese film, director Inagaki Hiroshi released The Three Treasures, or Nippon Tanjo, The Birth of Japan, in its Japanese title, a big budget historical fantasy epic that retold the myths of Amaterasu and Susanoo for contemporary audiences. Part of the appeal was that people already knew the stories and knew what to expect. However, the film also demonstrated newer changes that drew heavily from entertainment, incorporating the success of kaiju films and their American 1930s monster film predecessors. The Three Treasures recast the Yamata no Orochi as a huge animatronic and kaiju-style monster to be defeated in a spectacular battle. It also portrayed the deities as the same kind of figures seen in Hollywood and Japanese films of that era, upstanding and morally upright, but still human and therefore relatable all at the same time. Essentially, this film returned entertainment to the Japanese myths. This was not a standalone. The reuse of the myths continued into the development of manga, which, while it had existed earlier, really began to boom in the late 50s and continues through to today. Tezuka Osamu, the famous so-called god of manga, discusses the myths at least once in Hinotori, or Phoenix, his magnum opus. There's a volume which is set in ancient Japan and does incorporate the Susanoo Amaterasu myth to a small extent, although it's not the main focus. Here are some other and potentially more niche examples of pop culture drawing from manga and anime that utilize the myths, and I'm sure those of you in the audience can think of many others. The 1980s series 5-Star Stories, it does still technically continue today, but its heyday was 86 to 89, and features a space opera centered on a planet called Amaterasu, with a pseudo-Japanese style space empire that is also a force of good and civilization. The series Naruto, which began in the late 90s and still technically continues today, features ninja who use magical techniques, the most powerful of whom, a family with magical eyes, have techniques called Izanagi, Izanami, Amaterasu, Tsukuyomi, and Susanoo. You can see Susanoo here, which generates a magical force shield in the shape of a traditional Japanese warrior. For the record, Amaterasu is magical black fire that one cries from one's eyes and is so hot it can burn even other fire in this series. In 2004 to 2005, a lesser known series, but another example, Kanazuki no Miko, or Priestesses of the Godless Month, recasts Amaterasu and Susanoo as schoolgirls in love with one another who have to fight against the Yamata no Orochi, who are now a set of mecha pilots. What do we see from all of this? Well, certain features of the ancient myths are deliberately being recast. Amaterasu's connections to fire, light, and civilization, Susanoo as both a protective and a chaotic force, but otherwise they're being used more as referential points, as empty signifiers, than because of direct connections to the things people know. All of this comes back together in the now very famous and award-winning 2006 video game Ookami, which sees Amaterasu in the form of a wolf using traditional Japanese artwork to control the elements and finish out the ancient myths / defeat deities, including new creations like Yami, a force of darkness. Once again, the basic elements and understanding are there, but at this point, the myths are being used more as signifiers of Japanese identity and of a set of shared cultural norms than necessarily because of the specifics of either their narratives or faith. The deities Amaterasu and Susanoo are still worshipped at shrines across Japan, as is Tsukuyomi and their parents Izanagi and Izanami. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki have been translated into modern Japanese, as well as dialect, and including other languages, and are available in scholarly annotated form as well. Yet the gods and their stories and qualities, as demonstrated by their spread through pop culture, are still understood very differently from how they were even only a century ago, if not longer. And in order to understand what they may mean today, we have to also understand how these changes occurred. This recognition of a past that both distorts any original image while informing what comes later is, I believe, a component of more than just these two gods in this one set of myths. It's a quality of living mythological systems, particularly those with long histories, and presumably existed even for systems now dead, like those of Greco-Roman or Norse mythology. By highlighting what these changes were and how they lead in turn to later understandings, I hope to provide a model for how to perceive myths as dynamic collections of stories and images, and perhaps to better understand how and why we make and remake them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joshua. So one of my absolute favorite manga is Kono Fumio's Ballpoint Kojiki. And I love the way she's using only by ballpoint pen and visualize also to like a story, and also by using original text. So that sort of things is quite like quite interesting for me to how the artist and probably the people visualized and embodied the god and kami from prehistory to the contemporary. Thank you so much. We already got 4 questions, and I opened the question box. Our first question is, shouldn't Ainu religions, shouldn't Ainu religions also be counted as a native religion, or are they very similar?
Thank you. That's actually an excellent question. So there's I think 2 ways to answer this. The first, which arguably is somewhat flippant, is that assumes that one wants to treat the Ainu and the Japanese as the same society, and there could be various reasons for wanting to consider them the same society or not. And I'm not trying to wade into any modern political debate by saying that. I'm saying that even if we had records of Ainu faith that go back longer than maybe 200 years, which unfortunately we don't, the question of whether we would consider those native, or what native even means, and you're right, that is actually a very loaded term, especially politically. What native even means in that context is a question that I think would have to be answered in order to answer this question. The other way to attack this, which would be to agree, which I personally do, I do agree, actually, yes, they should be considered native religion, is the fact that unfortunately we don't know as much about Ainu beliefs as we would like. We know what was managed to be transmitted by Ainu today and over the past few centuries, which is unfortunately fairly broken up. And we also know from records that late Edo and Meiji scholars, ethnographers, as well as traders left about Ainu behaviors, but I do not believe, and I've never encountered, even in research in Japanese, sort of the kind of depictions of an Ainu pantheon that allow for detailed comparisons. So it's not something that is really brought in, but it is, to be honest, it is a blind spot. And thinking about it, it's something that I will probably need to address going forward. It's not something that's in the book. And it's something that in either future editions or in future work on this, I really should take into account, as should I look into Ryukyuan faith as well, which also, depending on how you want to answer that question, is a native Japanese faith.
Thank you so much. And next question. Thank you for the fascinating talk. Chickens appear prominently in the 19th century print of Amaterasu in your slides. Yet chickens were not common in ancient Japan. Do you think that views of chickens changed over the centuries?
Thank you. And I actually see our question after this relates to this as well, with not chickens, but roosters. Yeah. So to be honest, and this is something I need to delve into more, to be honest, I don't actually know when and where chickens are connected to Amaterasu. They certainly are. Atsuta Shrine, Atsuta Jinja in Nagoya, which is supposedly where the sword is kept, although whether the kusanagi there is the actual sword or is a replica is another issue, because the real kusanagi may have been lost at the end of the Heian period. That's a whole other can of worms. Atsuta Shrine has always had sacred chickens, which today, like the deer in Nara, are living national treasures. And those chickens are supposedly Amaterasu's messengers. Yet chickens, correctly, were not common in ancient Japan and do not appear in the myths. The closest would be the 3-legged crow, the yata, sorry, not 3-legged crow is the Taoist symbol, the yatagarasu, the 8-legged crow, or whatever it is. We're not actually sure how to translate yatagarasu, which appears to guide the first emperor, Jimmu, Amaterasu's 7th generation grandchild, from southern Kyushu up to what's now Nara. But while there are bird imagery, there's also the white bird in the Yamato Takeru story. There's a lot of bird imagery in the myths, but there's nothing domestic chicken related. I would guess, and I am purely hazarding a guess here, that it might relate to the body of work known as the Chusei Nihongi, or medieval Nihon Shoki. So starting around the same time as we see discussions of Shinto under that name, basically very late 11, early 1200s, and then proceeding to 13, 1400s, we get people who write in books the phrase Nihongi Iwaku, the Nihon Shoki says, and then they present a myth as justification for something. In almost all of these cases, what they claim the Nihon Shoki says is not anything that either the Nihon Shoki or the Kojiki actually say. For example, one very famous one from a 14th century work of Watarai Shinto, which is the priests at Ise Shrine, Amaterasu Shrine, states that Amaterasu turns into a male snake and copulates with the Ise Virgin every night, and that's why she has to be unmarried. And that this, and it actually quotes that the Nihon Shoki and then says this. This is not a Nihon Shoki quote. Nothing about this is anywhere in the Nihon Shoki or the Kojiki. There is no priestess of Amaterasu in either text. So where were they getting this? Scholars in Japan have been debating this for a while. I don't know if there's been anything in the past 5 years or so, but there's not a huge amount of conclusions. But it is a fascinating area of study, and I would think that the importation of chickens, because this is also when certain shrines like Atsuta become important, that the use of chickens may be a medieval development and therefore might be linked to probably continental ideas of the sun that have now become internalized. But again, this is speculation, and I would love to do more with this. So thank you.
That's interesting. So the roosters is the bird telling you the sunrise, right?
Right.
And I think the 18th, 19th century kabuki performance is sometimes as a sort of like a signage to make it like getting sunrise or something. And might the 19th century ukiyo-e artist inspired from that? I don't know really, but it's a great discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so next question. Not checking but roosters. Please explain as also in other Shinto Buddhist religious paintings.
I honestly, I think I have to default to what I had spoken about before. I would assume roosters because of their connection to the sun, but this is actually something I admit I don't know very much about, is why roosters specifically. I will not discount that there is a Buddhist or potentially even Taoist connection. The question of Taoism in Japan is another big topic that there's not a lot of clarity on. But I would think that further research might, again, locate this as a medieval development and probably connected to some continental beliefs that had been internalized. But again, that's all speculation.
Thank you so much. Next question. Besides the Shinto Buddhist, Shinbutsu Shugo, deities associated with the sun or Amaterasu, such as Dainichi Nyorai and Ufodoji, are there other Shinto Buddhist deities? If so, how should they be understood in terms of Shinbutsu Shugo? Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you very much for that question. And for anyone who's wondering, Shinbutsu Shugo, or the combination of Buddhism and Shinto, is a modern term for the intertwining of these two religions and their practices that goes back essentially as far as we have written records. These syncretic deities, there's actually a lot of them, and it's not also just one. Uhodoji is not the only one combined with Amaterasu. Kannon, or Avalokiteshvara, the very, very famous Bodhisattva of compassion, is also in some cases connected. And that's just with Amaterasu, as are reflexes of Rushana, of Vairochana, the solar Buddha. And that's, again, just with Amaterasu. Many other Shinto deities, including local deities, are perceived in the medieval era as reflexes of Buddhist deities. And the reason for this, I guess I will have to get a little more deeply into Honji Suijaku. There's going to be a lot of terminology, so I apologize. But there's this term honji suijaku, which means original elements and emanating traces, that is actually developed originally in China, but it comes to Japan around the 13th century. The idea, to put it extremely simply, is the Japanese needed to be prepped for Buddhism before it came to Japan. So Buddhist deities and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas purposefully reincarnated themselves as the Japanese deities to make sure that certain ideas of morality were already there and make it easier for Buddhism to flourish when it finally got to Japan for real. And by this argument, Amaterasu is not her own deity, but is and has always been an incarnation of multiple Buddhist deities, specifically to prep the Japanese spirit for Buddhism. And this logic was actually applied in a whole number of medieval treatises to just about any major deity, local or otherwise. That well, clearly this deity, because of these attributes, is a reflex of often more than one Buddhist figure. So that's sort of the very short version. There's tons of work on this, and if you're curious, I can point you towards some things. I know I keep saying Bernard For's excellent double volume on medieval Japanese Buddhism and its syncretic relationship with Shinto is an excellent starting point from a scholarly perspective.
Thank you so much. Next question. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering, do you think that the original Amaterasu is identical with the sun, or that Amaterasu is a deity that is connected to the sun, but not identical to it? Means, are we still in the state of ancient nature worship, or is Amaterasu a hidden deity that is more than just the astronomic sun?
So at the risk of being frustrating, my answer to this is yes, in the sense of yes to all of it. Firstly, I would push back against the idea of just ancient nature worship, as if nature worship is ever something simple. There's a sort of that thinking of nature worship as something that lacks complexity and depth is somewhat of an orientalizing notion that that makes it appear as though these people could not have possibly come up with a detailed philosophical set drawing from nature. Putting that aside for the moment, though, I do think Amaterasu always had multiple elements. The fact that what's most important to her portrayal in, say, the Kojiki is rice fields, weaving, purity, shame, and actually, I didn't talk about this at all, but armor. In fact, she's never arrayed as a female. Her only physical description in either text is of male armor, which comes, I didn't really talk about this, when Susanoo goes up to heaven, she initially says, she shows up in armor to block his way and says, don't come in here, you'll just be annoying. I'm paraphrasing. And he says, well, what if I promise not to be? And she goes, how can I trust you? And his response is, well, let's have each other's children, and whoever's children are more beautiful will prove who is more righteous. And so they exchange jewelry. They each chew each other's jewelry and spit it out, and the things they spit out become their children. Amaterasu spits out his jewelry as 5 strong boys, and he spits out her jewelry as 3 beautiful girls. And because girls are more beautiful and delicate than boys, she acknowledges that he has a pure heart and lets him into heaven. There is so much interesting, I mean, I didn't really have time to go into this, but this little interlude, I personally think is absolutely fascinating and reveals a whole bunch of things. Amaterasu is militarily minded. Her energy produces masculine elements. And by the way, the second of these sons is the one whose descendants go on to become the imperial family. All of her sons' names are related to rice cultivation. His daughters' names, I mean, they're technically both of their children, but Susanoo's daughters' names are related to rushing water, and they become the triple deity oracle of Munakata Island off of Fukuoka. So Amaterasu is actually a really strong masculine, but also cultivation-oriented deity. And I think all of these are very distant almost from certain solar projections. There is an argument that they represent Indic solar, Surya, the sun god, the Indian sun god in the Vedic the Vedic myths from ancient North India and potentially earlier Indo-European mythology does have some similar characteristics, but I also think that's a huge stretch. So.
Thank you. Okay, so we got 3 more questions. Is the
Okay.
mirror at its shrine one of the original insignia of Japan? And what do we know about the other 2?
Thank you for this question. Oh, the 3 imperial regalia. What I wouldn't give to be able to study even one of them in person. So yes, supposedly the mirror is the original mirror that Amaterasu's reflection holds in. Supposedly, if anyone who is not a male of imperial blood looks at it directly, they will explode or burst into fire. It is always kept heavily wrapped. The last official recorded person to look on it was in the 1700s. It wasn't even present at the enthronement in 2019. It does not leave Ise. It has been stolen a few times, but no one has officially seen it. I have no idea if any of the priests have ever looked at it or if the emperor could ask to look at it. None of that's ever made public. But certainly no scholar in centuries has been allowed to even gaze on it, and theoretically it would kill you. The other 2, the jewel strand, which may be 1 bead, it may be many. It's a magatama, which is a curved jewel, but the way it's described in the myth leads people to think it's plural. It's kept at the imperial palace. It's the only one that has supposedly never been stolen or lost. It's been taken, but it's always been returned. Whereas both the mirror and the sword have been stolen at times. Again, it was in a covered box, as was the sword at the enthronement, supposedly. Those of you who may have watched the enthronement in 2019 on TV might have seen these 2 lacquer boxes on tables. One was supposedly the sword, the other supposedly the jewel strand. We don't, again, there's, as far as I know, there isn't even anyone, even the Edo period, who writes about anyone in memory having seen it. It's always been wrapped, etc. So again, people might, I mean, for all we know, the emperor today could take it out and look at it if he wants to, but that's not going to be made public. The sword. This is the biggest, Kusanagi is the biggest problem here, because the Heike Monogatari and many other similar documents that are only demi-fictional from the early medieval era mention that during the Genpei War in the 1180s, the sword was dropped to the bottom of the sea. In the 1200s, an imperial edict insists that that was a replica of the sword and that the original has always been at Atsuta Shrine. Newsflash, Atsuta Shrine is never mentioned in the ancient texts, so why the sword would have always been there is itself a question. That's the shrine with the chickens outside of Nagoya. It's a really cool place to visit. So was the sword lost? Were there replicas? Does it even exist? These are all questions that have actually been discussed for centuries. For the record, the first shogunate, the Minamoto shogunate in the Kamakura period, their argument for why the shogun was necessary is that since the sword has been lost to the sea, its embodiment of Japan's martial power now passes to the shogun. We don't, the reason the gods reclaimed the sword was because it is no longer necessary. It's often portrayed as a 7-branched sword because of a famous 7-branched sword at Isunokami Shrine in Nara, but it's never described that way in the ancient text. It's always described as just basically a beautiful, typical ancient sword.
Thank you. I was born in Nagoya, so it's slightly close to us.
Have you been? I'm assuming you've been to Atsuta
Of course.
It's
Yeah, okay, so we got 2 more questions. I love the way pop culture interprets mythical figures such as Marvel, Thor, and Loki to use my own Nordic myths as an example. I'm currently writing a story that features original interpretation of Amaterasu. I do it out of genuine love and interest for the myths and culture. But would you say that it's okay for me to do, or I'm being culturally insensitive?
So firstly, I don't know that I am qualified to answer this question as much as anyone might be, because I am not Japanese. I am, for all that I care very much about these topics and have a long history of living in and working in Japan, these myths are not part of my construction of self-identity in a sort of unconscious method. And I don't feel that I'm qualified to comment on whether or not this would or wouldn't be found insensitive. I think that's something that you might need to ask people for whom Amaterasu is a part of their, whether self-chosen or not, a part of their identity from an earlier point. I would say that if you want to look at fiction concerning Amaterasu, two things. Firstly, as with any work of adaptive fiction, be careful, be courteous, do your research, and attempt to make sure that you are not claiming roles for this figure that would be insulting to people who may take this for a part of them. The other part, that's essentially cultural competency. The other part of this is there are quite a few Japanese works of fiction that deal with this. One of them is actually an English translation right here, and I have the Japanese up there too, of a famous 1980s series by Ogiwara Noriko. It's the Japanese title is Sorairo Magatama, for anyone who may have read it. This won awards in the 80s. They're children's fantasy novels that re-envision the myths. And this first one in particular takes Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi and makes them evil rulers of an ancient Japanese kingdom who have to be overthrown by a gender-neutral Susanoo. And this is, again, 1984 when this was written. So there are models that I would say you could look at as ways in which people have played with the myths. But again, I would say just be careful and talk to people who may have a stake in this.
Thank you. So we have got 2 more questions, but the time is strictly limited. So we have now 2 questions. Then we will just finish the lecture.
Okay.
How strong is the hangover from state Shinto in contemporary Japanese society? Big question, I know, but just curious how modern attitudes are shaped by this.
So, you know, that's a tricky question because on one hand, the argument is state Shinto is completely demolished, and most contemporary Japanese people, at least, claim to be either non-religious or not strongly believing in Shinto. At the same time, there are lots of leftovers. Every major state Shinto shrine is still important. Meiji Jingu in Tokyo was a state Shinto shrine. Yasukuni Jinja is a shrine. Kashihara Jingu down in Nara, which celebrates the first emperor, and they even built a fake kofun because there is no burial mound for Emperor Jinmu. So they built one because there has to be one. These are all still major tourist sites. There's also, again, the fact that these ideas permeated society, and even discussions such as, for example, what to do with current history textbooks have echoes of the dismantling process. So I would tentatively say that there is a large hangover, but that it is an invisible one. I mean, if we want to use the hangover metaphor, it's sort of like a vague headache hovering around the back of your mind that has never gone away, but most people would probably not notice or would think is normal.
Thanks. And last question. In your description, Amaterasu sounds like Athena. It is a deep human archetype that emerged independently as agriculture, cell culture, and civilization develop.
Ooh, thank you for that very interesting question. So my instinct is to reject any categoric archetypes. However, so that's a very sort of Joseph Campbell analysis of myths, the idea that there are these basic archetypes. On the other hand, the reason that is such a popular theory even today is because there is evidence that there are certain basic archetypes. Essentially, you picked Athena, because she is one of the Greek deities who is a non-Indo-European original. Athena and Poseidon, their names are not Greek, and they do not fit. It's still somewhat scattershot, but there's attempts to recreate Indo-European religion, or at least basic ideas, and there are no deities. There's no ocean deity, and there's no knowledge. Like, certain features are not a part of it. So something like that makes you wonder, because if these are gods that do appear to share similar categories and develop essentially completely independently, what does that reveal? On one hand, people did travel. And as the Silk Road is a perfect example of later on, I don't want to categorically deny that there may be a back and forth between civilizations. On the other hand, it is a very attractive idea that there are basic archetypes that humans gravitate towards that reflect our psychologies. And that these, which is sort of a more nuanced contemporary understanding of Campbell's theories of basic mythical archetypes. And I would say that makes sense to me, but at the same time, there are only so many parallels. For all of her connections, Athena, as far as I'm aware, does not appear to have been a solar deity. And she also is not connected to rulership quite the same way. And the more you try to make parallels, so the question is, how basic is the archetype? How deep does it go? If it's something as simple as there are female civilizational deities with martial capabilities and connections to light, those are actually fairly simple to make. I could believe that that it could be an archetype. But once you start getting into more specific definitional aspects, you start having to create reasons for more labored comparisons. So my answer to what is fundamentally an unanswered question and potentially unanswerable, my tentative answer would be, it's possible that there are deep archetypes here, but I would say that they would be extremely basic and would have to relate to human psychology as opposed to societal levels or sort of societal needs.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Sainsbury Institute actually now publishing and updating the web exhibition Nara to Norwich, exploring sort of religious interactions among Christianity, Buddhism and Shinto from Nara to Norwich. So this is something, if you like, please have a look at our website. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Frydman, for an excellent and illuminating talk. This talk is recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel. Also, the lecture report will be published in our next monthly e-bulletin in early February. So you may also receive a link to a feedback form in a follow-up email from Zoom tomorrow. We'll be very grateful for any feedback you can provide, and your comments are invaluable in helping us to improve our lecture series. Next month's Thursday lecture will be on the 16th of February and will be given by our Robert and Lisa Sainsbury Fellow, Dr. Sheila Lee, on the topic of modern craftsmanship in rural Japan, in which she will discuss institutionalized creativity and everyday craftsmanship in Tachikui, Tambasasayama, Hyogo Prefecture. I hope many of you will be able to join for what promises to be a fascinating lecture. Lastly, the Sainsbury Institute wishes to thank the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, the Great Britain Sasakawa Foundation, and Yakult UK for supporting this lecture series. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you very much.